The only thing they've ever been is connected to their military by it. As that privatization goes on, isn't it going to get harder and harder to enforce a sanction that right now is failing already? And if so, what do we need to do to create a regime in which individuals who can operate much more globally and without the cover of the government are in fact part of the shell game of buying assets, often nuclear related?
I think you're right, and privatization is going to be a challenge in the future.
Or crony privatization, if you will.
Absolutely. But also, I think you made a very good point about having more of a collective approach to dealing with the UAE and this transshipment issue. I really think that's an important issue. The UAE is now the #1 exporter of goods and services to Iran. The UAE remains the #1 country that the Commerce Department is concerned about with these post-shipment verifications that fail. We sell our goods to the UAE, we go over and inspect them, they're either not there and they're not being used as intended. So there needs to be a concerted focus on the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, in closing, I went into Libya on the first trip into Libya after we lifted all visitation sanctions. It was in a U.S. military aircraft. And we had several hours before we met with their, quote, leader. And what I discovered was that there was more American goods, more American brand names in Libya on that first trip than I would typically see at Walmart. So, you know, I have been somebody who is critical not of the laws we pass. I think the sanctions we're passing are right, and they're attempting to give real power. But it's very clear that unless we get implementation from the administration, someday, somewhere, we're going to have an event no different than October 23rd, 1983 at the Beirut barracks, where 241 Marines lost their life. The next one will be nuclear, and it will be exponentially greater, and it's likely to be here in the United States. I yield back.
That's why we're having this hearing. Yes, Congresswoman Maloney, 5 minutes.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having the hearing, and all of the panelists for your testimony and for your commitment of implementing the sanctions. I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Neuroder, since this committee has direct responsibility both legislatively and with oversight over procurement. Mr. Neuroder, under the new sanctions signed by the President, GSA is required to revise the federal acquisition regulations to require a certification from each person that is a prospective contractor, that the person and any person owned or controlled by the person does not engage in any activity for which sanctions may be imposed under Section 5 of the Iran Sanctions Act. Specifically, can GSA commit to meeting the timetable, you have committed to meeting the timetable under the law, to require this particular part to certify that contractors are not conducting any prohibited business?
Yes, we are definitely committed to doing that. We are definitely committed to having the interim rule in place. The folks in GSA are fully aware that this has started, because the key is to implement the rule once it is in effect. And that's what we will do.
Well, specifically, what steps has GSA taken to ensure that companies that are making accurate and complete certifications, how do you know they're telling you the truth when they sign that box? Are you reviewing it or doing any research to make sure that they are accurate in what they're saying? Because obviously many companies have been conducting business in the prior sanctions that we had before our country, but before the world, actually.
In the context of certifications and representations, that's a normal part of our business. And that's what companies do, and they certify as to many things. And
but what do you do to make sure that what they're certifying is accurate?
Well,
is there any, what if a company knowingly makes a false certification, and you find out, as we found out in Mr. Christoph's report, that many companies were doing business with America and Iran in direct conflict with the prior Iran Sanctions Acts? What do we do if a company knowingly signs that box and made a mistake or is just outright lying?
Speaking from my view as the GSA suspension and debarment official, I am very concerned about contractor integrity and honesty. If that kind of situation comes to my attention, if need be, I'll ask the IG to investigate further to get me the facts. Otherwise, I have the ability to call in the company and ask them whether the certification was accurate or not, and if not, to tell me what the facts are.
And what if, the question is, what if you find out that they made a mistake or were outright lying? Is there a fine? Do you debar them? Do you terminate the contract? What do you do if you find that situation? You know, there was this one article that was in the New York Times. I'd like permission to put it in the record, Mr. Chairman, about U.S. enriches companies defying its policies on Iran. And this was in March 6 of 2010. And it talks about companies that were defying our law, yet getting billions, literally, in American contracts. What happened? Did we terminate those contracts? Did we fine the people? If you find someone knowingly really violates the law, you said you'd do an IG investigation. And what if the IG investigation comes back, or the investigation by the New York Times comes back and says that they are defying our policies, violating the law? Do we fine them? Do we terminate our government contracts with them? What do we do?
Specifically, I could speak to what I would do if I find that contractor non-responsible based upon an integrity issue. I would debar them.
You would debar them?
Yes.
But there's no real requirement in law. What happened to these companies that are getting billions in American contracts and defying prior Iranian sanctions? Did anything happen to these companies?
I don't know, ma'am.
Well, could you find out and get back to us and let us know?
Yes.
The new sanctions also prohibit the head of an executive agency from entering into or renewing a contract for the procurement of goods or services with a person that exports sensitive technology to Iran. And what role will GSA play in administering this portion of the law? That's a very sensitive area, sensitive technology. What role will GSA play in administering this section of the law?
Of this statute here?
Yes.
As far as I know, that would be included in the FAR case.
That will be included. My time has expired. Thank you very much. Thank you for your
Time
service.
has expired. I now yield to gentleman from Indiana, Congressman Burton.
One of the things that has concerned me was, I guess, back in during the Clinton administration, Madeleine Albright waived the penalties on a Russian company and I think a South American company because they had done business with Iran in violation of the law. I think it was Gazprom, 1998, and Petronas oil companies. But Madeleine Albright waived them at the direction of the President, and the President said that the United States would not impose sanctions on violators from the European Union, presumably with the hope that the EU would instead immediately take action on its own, but it didn't. And so these early sanctions made it clear to violators that they were not seriously threatened by the sanctions. One of the things that concerns me, as I said before, and I think Mr. Issa mentioned it as well, is that there's so much waiver authority by the President on almost every one of the sanctions that are in the bill, which I opposed in the conference committee. But nevertheless, it's in there, and I just would like to once again express my concern about that, because in the past, no president, going back to beyond Clinton, has ever imposed any sanctions that have been carried through. The other thing I'd like to ask is, I noticed in the United Nations legislation, it does provide a mechanism for civil penalties for financial institutions that are involved in any kind of a bank transaction, of $250,000 penalty or an amount that's twice the amount of the transaction that is the basis of the violation. But one thing that I I can't really ascertain is whether or not the language in the bill that we passed provides a mechanism for freezing Iranian assets in the United States. I'm not sure that the UN bill resolution does as well. Can you tell me, any of you, whether or not freezing assets in banks, their money in the United States, is allowed in the United States, the bill that we passed and went through conference committee, or in the UN or any of the other bills that passed, the EU or any of them? Freezing their assets, absolutely saying you cannot let them have their money.
Yeah, most Iranian assets in the United States would already be frozen now under a whole wide variety of Iran sanctions legislation. And the Treasury Department over the past few years has designated most Iranian banks under our counterterrorism or counterproliferation authority. That freezes their assets to the extent that there are assets in the United States. There would be, frankly, very few assets, if any, of those banks in the United States. So I think what the problem that the bill was trying to get at with respect to banks was not freezing their assets that are under U.S. control, because there aren't any assets under U.S. control, and we've already designated these banks and applied sanctions on them. What I think it was trying to get at was third-party banks that were providing these designated Iranian banks indirect access into the U.S. And that's what the bill tries to get at. And I think it's very important. I think it was a very important problem that Congress identified, and it's something that we're going to try to use to solve. But the assets of these banks, to the extent that they're in U.S. jurisdiction, are likely already frozen.
Mr. Einhorn, you're with the State Department. In the event that General Electric, which has been accused of doing business with subsidiaries through their subsidiaries to Iran, if they continue to do business in any way and there's sanctions imposed upon them because of that business being conducted, would the State Department in any way recommend a waiver of that penalty? Because that's been done, as I said before, by Madeleine Albright during the Clinton administration.
Congressman, without reference to any particular U.S. entity.
Well, any company. I just used that as an example.
Any company. When we get information, credible information, that a company is involved in sanctionable activity under the law, we will examine this very closely. We'll go to the company itself, we'll go to U.S. embassies, see what they can find out, we'll inquire of the intelligence community, we'll accumulate...
Well, let me just say, will the recommendation of the State Department be that they will not waive the sanctions to the President?
I can't predict what the recommendation of the State Department would be. It will depend on the situation. You mentioned, Congressman Burton, you talked about waiver authority and so forth. Sometimes it's very useful to have that authority in there, and I'll tell you why. Sometimes you deal with a company that may have engaged in sanctionable activity. What you want them to do is to stop that activity and to pledge not to repeat it again. You need some flexibility in the law, essentially to bargain with that company. And if there's a situation where a company has stopped all sanctionable activity and pledges not to resume it, then perhaps the waiver authority, the ability to waive sanctions, is a useful tool to stop that sanctionable activity. And that's worthwhile.
Gentleman's time has expired. And I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Einhorn, I guess what you're getting from some of these questions is whether or not any administration has been strong enough on any of these sanctions through time. While I have faith in this administration, with all due respect, I'm not sure your testimony would evoke greater faith that we would move forward appropriately with the new sanctions. And from page 4 of your testimony, in this review, we identified a number of cases dating from before the Obama administration which appeared problematic and warranted more thorough consideration. Given the extraordinary circumstances here and the fact that the time frame for a viable deliverable weapon seems to be collapsing upon itself, What does problematic mean? If you add that into the equation and the fact that we're reading articles every day about how spry other countries seem to be circumventing these actions, are we spry enough? Are we forceful enough? And can you be a little more forceful from that testimony?
Thank you, Congressman. I can't speak for previous administrations. I certainly can't speak for the 8 years of the George W. Bush administration, where no determinations were made, no sanctions were made, no determinations of even sanctionability. All I can speak for is the Obama administration. And Secretary Clinton early on instructed us to act aggressively to implement the law. We have carried out a thorough review of a large number of cases. We winnowed those down to less than 10. We're now in the process of engaging other agencies. The Secretary of State has been delegated authority to take decisions. We have to get the input from other agencies. We'll provide that input to Secretary Clinton, and she will make decisions. I would say that she, before very long, will have to make determinations under the law as to the sanctionability of this relatively small number of cases, fewer than 10.
And can you ballpark your time frame here?
She wants us to move expeditiously. As I say, the dossiers are out to other agencies. We need to hear back from them, get the recommendations, and feed those to the Secretary, and she can make decisions.
And I appreciate that. And for the panel, switching directions, given the short time frame we have with you, I just, to the extent you can, tell us a little more your thoughts about how China plays into this equation, filling the gap, perhaps flooding everything else that we're trying to, overwhelming everything else we're trying to do here?
Yeah, I think China is one of the countries in which the U.S. attention has to turn to. The EU sanctions were passed, but China has gone over the past 15 years from having minimal trade with Iran to being at either the first or the second biggest importer and exporters of goods and services to Iran. They are aggressive in investing in Iran's energy sector. Their companies have been sanctioned under the non-proliferation provisions multiple times to no effect. So that's the next country that I think we need to turn our attention to.
And by attention, your suggestions?
Mr. Einhorn certainly has some suggestions, but I think there has to be a recognition that, at least with some of the non-proliferation sanctions, when you have Chinese companies that have been sanctioned 3 or more times, there has to be a reevaluation of the effectiveness of those particular sanctions because it's not changing their behavior.
If I can just follow up, Congressman, you're right to identify China. China is of concern to us in this regard. China has backfilled when a number of responsible countries have distanced themselves from Iran. We need to speak with the Chinese. We've begun to raise this at the highest levels with Chinese leaders. Deputy Assistant Secretary Glazer and I will be going to China in August to begin a dialogue, and this dialogue will be pursued at all levels. We need for them to enforce the Security Council resolutions conscientiously, and we also need for them not to backfill when responsible countries have distanced themselves from Iran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to read some quotes from when this issue, a couple of times that it came up before, and if I have any time, if there's any time left, then I'd be happy for you to respond. But a little over 3 months ago, the Congressional Quarterly on April 22nd had an article which said, quote, "Business groups say the House and Senate bills could effectively prohibit U.S. businesses from partnering with certain foreign companies, even if the relationships have nothing to do with Iran." And then they added, the National Association of Manufacturers released a study arguing that at least $25 billion in exports and 210,000 jobs could be lost if sanctions legislation is enacted. The next day in the Hill newspaper, Patrick Disney and Laura Friedman, and I'm not familiar with who they are, wrote this in an article. They said the U.S. has sanctioned Iran for decades with little to show for it, and added that certain, quote, certain sanctions have unambiguously failed to achieve their objective, contributing instead to the suffering of ordinary Iranians. And last December 15th, the National Security Subcommittee had a hearing in this very room in which I participated, and 4 witnesses testified, and I will tell you that all 4 of them were against sanctions. And Dr. George Lopez, chair of the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame, said that sanctions, quote, will inflict economic pain in Iran but produce no political gain on issues important to the United States. In fact, research in the history of sanctions cases predicts that these sanctions imposed on this Iranian government in the manner imposed in H.R. 2194 will do more harm than doing nothing. James F. Dobbins, director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center, said that while sanctions are sometimes appealing, they are not without cost to the imposing states, and, quote, some of that cost is eventually transferred to the American taxpayer. Further sanctions against Iran are not likely to alter Tehran's nuclear policies. Sanctions will weaken the state economically and even militarily, and also strengthen that imposes it, and strengthen the regime's domestic support and hold on power. In other words, strengthen Iran's hold on power. Journalist Robin Wright said, quote, the regime could exploit new sanctions as an excuse to clamp down further on the opposition, and said, quote, sanctions also hold the potential to hurt the public more than the regime. And finally, Suzanne Maloney, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, said, quote, sanctions do not offer a cure-all or a silver bullet for resolving our long-standing concerns about Iranian policy. There should be no illusions about the likelihood that even more rigorous and more broadly implemented sanctions can produce a reversal of Iran's nuclear calculus. And what I'm concerned about is that sanctions will end up hurting the poor and lower income people of Iran more than anybody, while doing very little good for us. And I noticed that Mr. Christoph said in his testimony a while ago that because these sanctions we have imposed now are the toughest ever, that we need to very soon have a very good analysis of the effectiveness of these sanctions. Now, if anyone wishes to respond. Yes, sir, Mr. Einhorn.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. There's a long debate on the utility of sanctions. Do they work? What's their impact? And so forth. Our view is that sanctions are not an end in themselves. They're a vehicle for changing Iran's behavior. We want them to recalculate costs and benefits and come up with the conclusion that they're better off ending their defiance of the international community and meeting their international obligations. I think until recently, Iranians have been very self-confident that they could have their cake and eat it too. They could have their nuclear ambitions, but they could also have good commercial, financial relationships with the international community. What we've been trying to do is turn up the pressure on Iran so that it has to make a choice between one or the other. And there's pretty good evidence coming in every day that the Iranians are feeling the pressure. Every day another major company decides to distance itself from Iran, and we think Iran is beginning to feel the heat. We read in the papers by Iranian economists that their economic situation is worsening, that oil production is declining, that the cost of exports, the cost of imports is increasing because of the difficulty of getting financing. So we believe we have begun to turn the corner on this, and that Iran is feeling the pressure, but we have to continue stepping that up.
Well, let me just say, because my time is up, we have given people in our government great power through this sanctions legislation, but I hope that that power is exercised in a humane and judicious manner, so that we don't end up hurting an awful lot of people in the process.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Foster from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Christoph, were the Chinese sanctioned, the Chinese companies that were sanctioned, state-owned or privately owned companies?
You know, I don't know that, Mr. Foster, but I can try to get that information for you for the record.
Okay. Well, what I'm getting at is whether it's reasonable to view the Chinese government as basically a holding company, and so that the sanctions, presumably, if there's a subsidiary that violates the sanctions, that reflects onto the holding company as a general principle. Is that how it
Yes.
must work?
Yes.
Right. And so that, in the case, which I think is likely, that at least some of these sanctioned companies there, you could make a reasonable logical argument that, in fact, the holding company, namely the Chinese government, might be sanctioned as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if you could explore that.
Yeah, I'll look into that.
For the record. Deputy Secretary Glazer, what do you view the biggest holes are in the financial net that we're trying to cast around the IRGC? What are, for example, how are illicit arms or technology shipments typically paid for? Are there enhancements to the international reporting that would really do you a lot of good that we could encourage at the congressional level?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I'm glad you focused on the IRGC because I think that that's really one of the key entities we should be looking at. The IRGC is engaged in the whole range of bad conduct that we associate with Iran, from proliferation activities, terrorist activities, suppression of democracy within Iran. The IRGC is engaged across the board. It is also a very attractive target because they have such extensive economic and financial networks both within Iran and throughout the world. So that's their strength, but it's also their weakness. It also creates a target-rich environment. The challenge that we've had up until really the last month is getting universal action with respect to the IRGC. We've had tremendous success with that recently with 1929, and really most especially with the European Union's common position this week, which applies sanctions to the IRGC in Europe across the board. The IRGC as an entity plus numerous subsidiaries. Again, the challenge now, the challenge I don't think is a legislative one. I don't think it's an authority challenge. The challenge is to make this as broad and deep as possible, to get out on the road, to present information to the private sector, to present information to foreign governments, to let them know what kind of activity the IRGC is engaged in their countries, and then expect them to live up to their obligations under international law and under their domestic law. And that's what we have been doing, and that's what we are doing. And as Mr. Einhorn said, I think we're starting to see that that's working. And we both mentioned it, but I think it's worth underscoring. Qatar Alambia is one of the primary companies owned by the IRGC, and they just had to pull out of South Pars, and they had to pull out because, as they themselves admitted, it was against Iran's national interest for them to be involved because they couldn't get the international buy-in.
Are you seeing evidence that individuals are transferring money to private accounts offshore that you can't identify in havens, or is that something you're dealing with acceptably?
Well, the issue of bank secrecy havens is a broader issue than it applies to Iran. Look, the Iranians are very sophisticated, and they're very smart, and they have complex financial systems, and they know how to engage in deceptive financial practices, and they do. And we try to prevent that from happening. But the fact of the matter is that on a case-by-case basis, on a transaction-by-transaction basis, they're going to be able to do transactions that they want to do. The challenge is on the systemic level, because you can't run an economy on deceptive financial practices. And so the challenge is to make it costly or risky or less effective for them to do that. And I do think we're succeeding in that.
Okay. Let's see. Mr. Einhorn, the Iran Sanction Act has recently amended, states that the president shall initiate an investigation when credible evidence is presented, and I think a report within 180 days. How's that going? And
well, Congressman, this law was only enacted less than a month ago, and we're now in the process of figuring out how to implement it effectively and how to deal with the 180-day period. Often thorough investigations of these activities take longer than 180 days because often you get some initial public indication that a deal is in the works, but it may not be consummated for 3, 5, 10 years. So it's a challenge to wrap everything up in 180 days. We're trying to figure out how to do that.
But you are committed to the 180 day, at
absolutely.
least some kind of finding in 180 days.
Absolutely. We're committed to implementing that aspect of the law, all aspects of the law.
All right, gentlemen's time has expired. I now yield to gentleman from Arizona, Congressman Flake.
I thank the chair and thank those who've testified. I'm sorry I missed part of it, other obligations, but so I hope I'm not plowing the same ground here. But Mr. Einhorn, in your view, let me just step back a bit. Is it possible to have an effective sanctions regime without the active participation of Russia and China?
I think it's I mean, as your question implies, it is very important for Russia and China to be involved. They were involved to some extent already in the sense that they voted for Security Council Resolution 1929, which is the base for many of the national measures that have subsequently been taken. So that's positive. But we also need their effective enforcement of 1929, and we also ask them to recognize their responsibility as permanent members of the Security Council to go beyond 1929 and to join with the European Union and us and the Australians and Canadians and have a strong regime of pressure that can move Iran to meet its international obligations. But Russia and China are very important.
Very important, but not really helping, is what you're saying.
Well, recently Russia took an important decision. It decided that in accordance with the Security Council resolution, it would not deliver an advanced air defense system, the S-300, to Iran. We've been pressing Russia very hard for a number of years not to make that delivery, and they've agreed not to make it, and that's positive.
Should we worry about getting too far ahead of our allies, both our European allies and ahead of Russia and China as well? I mean, there are two schools of thought here. If we lead, that they'll follow, but there's also the notion that if we get too far out ahead, they won't. Where do you think we are now? Do we risk getting too far ahead so we don't have active, enthusiastic, ongoing cooperation, not just public, but privately enforcing these resolutions as well with Russia and China?
We are very grateful that the European Union took the decision it took this week. It set some very high standards for sanctions. We will use that high standard in our discussions. Danny Glazer and I will be in Seoul and in Tokyo next week to see if Japan and South Korea could come up to that mark. We'll also go to China later in the month. It's important that China step up and recognize its international responsibilities here.
With gasoline, we keep saying that we're targeting the regime and not the people of Iran. We're just looking at items that would help them build nuclear capacity. How is gasoline used to build nuclear capacity?
Well, gasoline is not directly used, obviously, to build nuclear capacity. But I think by putting some pressure on their access to refined petroleum products, you encourage them to recompute what's in their best interest and to recognize that unless they stop their defiance of the international community, the future for Iran will look a lot dimmer, and hopefully they're coming to that conclusion.
That's my point. I mean, it's not directly, but we all know how these sanctions regimes usually work. They only work if you have leaders that care a little more about the plight of the people. I mean, if we thought rationally, we certainly wouldn't have had the same embargo we've had in Cuba for 50 years, for example. So I worry that we say publicly, we don't want to hurt the Iranian people, we don't want to drive them into the arms of the regime, but then we target items that have nothing to do with building nuclear capacity, but would provide a pinch on the people without hurting the regime. We all know the regime finds ways, certainly, when we see just example after example after example of ways that the black market works here. And our own Secretary of State has said, use the term leaky. These sanctions are leaky, and that's quite an understatement. So anyway, thank you for your testimony.
If I could just respond to that, all sanctions regimes are leaky to some extent. But what we're seeing here is that the sanctions are becoming more and more comprehensive, and that's good. As far as the dealing with the people of Iran is concerned, our intention is not to harm the people of Iran. Our intention is to get the leadership of Iran to reconsider, and that's why we've done things like ensure that organizations like the IRGC and IRISL, the Iran shipping line, is specifically targeted. That will be an important signal to the elites of Iran.
Right, gentleman's time has expired, and I recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Congressman Van Hollen, for 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank all of you for your testimony today. I just want to follow up on some of the conversations that have, questions that have already been asked, and I think obviously there's consensus to the extent we can broaden those countries that are participating in the sanctions. Obviously, they're much more effective. And the step the EU took recently was another positive measure. To what extent does the sanctions regime that we have here overlap with what the EU has done? And what specific steps are we taking now with the EU to make sure that we have uniform enforcement as much as possible?
Well, Mr. Glazer may want to add to this. We have the most comprehensive sanctions regime against Iran than any other country in the world. You realize that.
Yes.
I think what the Europeans did this week really closed that gap quite significantly. There are still differences, but the gap was closed very significantly, and I think it was probably a very rude shock to the leaders of Iran to see the strength of the steps they took.
Just to follow up, there's been some concern expressed about the relationship with some of the banks in Germany, specifically, with respect to Iran. Could you comment on that, especially in light of the decision taken by the EU, how the EU decision will impact especially the question of German banks doing business with Iran?
Well, I think the EU decision, the EU common position, is going to significantly impact any German banks or any European banks that are doing business with Iran. So any German banks that are doing business with any of the 7 banks designated by the EU will have to stop. Any German or other European banks that do any sizable transaction with Iran will have to get pre-approval for that transaction, and they have to wait 4 weeks for that pre-approval. So it's really a huge step forward. You know, that said, there are some German banks. There's one German bank that was discussed in the press, EIH, that does remain a concern for us, and that's something that we continue to discuss with the Europeans and with Germany in particular. And I think their business will inevitably decline based on the new EU measures, but it is something that's going to remain a subject of conversation between us and our allies in Germany.
All right. Mr. Einhorn, you mentioned the fact that China had voted for the resolution of the United Nations. Obviously, they also worked very hard to weaken some aspects of the proposal we put forward. So I'm pleased to hear you're going to be traveling there in the near future. How do you grade the prospects for getting the Chinese to really be serious about this effort in Iran? I mean, I think it's clear based on their actions to try and dilute sanctions at the UN, that they're obviously not on board. What goals do you have specifically for that trip? How would you measure success in your discussions with the Chinese?
Well, two important criteria. One is that they enforce the letter of Resolution 1929 conscientiously, and that if there are Chinese entities that are in any way assisting, for example, the missile programs in Iran, that China takes strong steps against those entities. That's one. Second, we want China to recognize its responsibility not to backfill when responsible governments show restraint and distance themselves from Iran. That will be very important. The Chinese will argue that they have important energy security needs, tremendous demands for energy. They need to do what's necessary to ensure energy security. In our view, they are overachieving in terms of their energy security needs. We think they have to kind of rebalance their priorities and recognize that as a permanent member of the Security Council, it's their responsibility to prevent proliferation and to put pressure on Iran and persuade Iran not to pursue nuclear weapons.
Thank you. My last question relates to the standard that applies to granting a waiver of the sanctions. And as I understand the legislation, the standard is that it be vital to the national security interests of the United States and that the government with primary jurisdiction over the sanctions violator is closely cooperating with the United States in this effort. This is probably by way of a comment more than a question, but I think it's absolutely essential that we keep that standard as tight as possible. And, you know, for example, I think it would be very difficult to argue today the Chinese or the Russians were meeting the intent of that language with respect to cooperation given their conduct. And so I would hope that you send the right signal to others as how you interpret that, because you don't want your decisions, a flexible interpretation of the rule, to send a green light to others that they're going to be able to get away with this. So I hope that will be that discretion will be pursued in a way that maximizes a tight, uniform sanctions regime. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentleman from Maryland. Now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Congressman Chafee.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. For the sake of clarity, in rapid fashion, I'm looking for like a yes or no here. I just want to make sure that each of your organizations is committed to the timetables laid out in legislation. You have the infrastructure, you have the resources, and that you're going to be able to make the timetables that are implemented in the legislation. Perhaps we can start with Mr. Einhorn.
If you want yes or no, yes.
Is there anything in your way to making sure that you get these done? Please continue down the line.
Yes.
Yes.
We don't have anything to implement, but we assure continued oversight on the part of GAO to make sure they are implementing it.
Thank you, thank you. Mr. Einhorn.
So that's a yes, right?
That's a yes.
That's an absolutely. That's good to hear. Mr. Einhorn, let's talk for a moment, if we could, about Turkey, given the recent situation. Can you assess the level of commitment that they have to helping and assisting in these efforts?
We believe the government of Turkey shares our objective of preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. We appreciate the hard work that Turkey has put in trying to persuade Iran to adopt a more reasonable position. Sometimes we differ with Turkey on tactics. For example, Turkey joined with Brazil and Iran in what was called the Tehran Declaration in May, and they supported what we considered to be an unacceptable version of a proposal we supported back in October on refueling the Tehran research reactor. We didn't appreciate the timing of that because it was on the eve of voting on the UN Security Council resolution, and perhaps some of the participants had in mind derailing that vote on a Security Council resolution. So sometimes we disagree with Turkey on tactics, but we believe their motivation is good. They want to solve this Iran nuclear issue just as we do.
Mr. Glazer, any sense or any assessment of using the Patriot Act along the way if we need to use that authority?
Yeah, we have a wide variety of authorities under the Patriot Act, under IEPA, and we consider all of those authorities. Any authority that we have that we think we could put to good use would be considered.
As the Treasury, and then I'd like to go to State if I could. My time will run short here. What are your top, just very rapidly because the time's so short, what are your top 3 concerns about Billy fully implementing all of these sanctions? Like, what are the 3 things that you're worried about that are obstacles that we need to overcome to actually fully implement? Yes, please.
To fully implement, you know, I keep coming back. The challenge is to make these sanctions as broad as possible, and what I mean by that is vigorous global implementation. That's the big challenge. We now have the tools, we have the authorities, really throughout the world. The challenge is global implementation, and when I say deep, I mean countries going as appropriate and as necessary beyond the scope of what they're.
So which three countries then would you be most worried about?
Well, I'll tell you which 3 regions I think need to be focused on right now, and that's the Middle East, Asia, and South America. Europe has taken strong action. We've taken strong action in North America. Australia's taken strong action, and you know, as Mr. Einhorn said, Bob and I are going to be traveling to Japan and South Korea next week. We're going to be in China later in the month. Asia is important. My boss, as I said before, Stuart Levy, is going to be in UAE in the next couple of weeks. The Middle East is important. South America is important too.
Mr. Einhorn?
I would agree with Danny's characterization. I would just say it's very important to maintain the momentum. Since June, when the Security Council resolution was adopted, there have been a series of actions, including U.S. executive order designations. We talked about Australia, Canada, Europe, and so forth. We have to keep up the momentum. The Iranian, part of this is psychological. Part is, practical on the ground, what's happening economically, but part of it is psychological. We have to demonstrate to Iran's leaders that the situation is going to deteriorate. It's going to continue to deteriorate unless they change their behavior. So keeping the momentum up throughout the summer into the fall will be critical.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The UN Sanctions Resolution 1929 was a positive step. However, the financial sanctions in the resolution left something to be desired. For example, only 1 new bank was added to the list of sanctioned entities. And even here in the U.S., the sanctions announced by the Treasury Department last month added only 1 bank to the list of those sanctioned. Is the Treasury Department aware of foreign financial institutions that continue to conduct business with sanctioned Iranian banks, and what steps is the Treasury Department taking to ensure corresponding relations between the U.S. and foreign banks are